end so poorly.
I'm not that concerned. Hello.
Ladies, because I would not be out here in this for nothing. I promise you.
It doesn't snow much in Decatur, Alabama, a city on the Tennessee River just about halfway between Birmingham and Nashville. But the day we were scheduled to interview Miss Frances Tate, the roads were covered in ice and snow. It was precarious, that walk to your door.
Despite the cold, Miss Tate was at the door with a big, welcoming smile on her face.
Hello, how are you?
Good morning.
Thank you so much. Miss Tate's house was like a little museum or vintage shop. She had this unique Victorian-era chaise longue at the entryway where we took off our winter boots. Ornate lamps with tassels lit our way to the living room, and art covered almost every inch of the walls.
Miss Tate's art was the reason we were there that day. She took us into the living room to explain how it all started, back in 2015.
I was at the building department, and I saw beautiful photos, and it said, Churches of Decatur, Alabama. And I looked, I didn't see one black church, and I thought, somebody need to do something about this. Clear as day, I know it was God telling me this. He said, why not you? And I said, I'm not doing that.
Miss Tate had planned on using her retirement from the telecommunications industry to paint. She was thinking flowers or landscapes or whatever else she fancied.
It took about a month. He wore me down. And I said, okay, God, I'm going to do it. So I started celebrating early Old Town with art.
Old Town is where Miss Tate grew up. As the name suggests, it's one of the most historic parts of the city of Decatur, which was founded in 1820.
It's almost like a peninsula, located northwest of Bank Street, bounded on its south by railroad tracks, and on its other sides by the Tennessee River.
But the area Miss Tate knows as Old Town today is only a portion of what the neighborhood used to encompass.
Instead of taking photographs, Miss Tate figured she'd apply her artistic skills to document Old Town. She used pen and ink and watercolors, using water from the river.
She started painting the black churches, which were fundamental to the Old Town community, but she didn't stop there.
I've gone street by street. I've drawn every house, business, and church. I've done about probably 350 buildings now.
For 6 years, Miss Tate hosted a free art show where she would show off her paintings. There would be live music and food, but all that ended with the pandemic. Now, the paintings are mostly just stockpiled in her living room.
Miss Tate had pulled out a few for us to get a closer look at.
Everything you see here, all of these are Old Town. So if you just want to kind of go through them, it just to see what the neighborhood was all about.
From the Civil War era to Miss Tate's youth in the 60s and 70s, Old Town was a vibrant Black community with hundreds of buildings.
We had everything in our neighborhood. Mm-hmm. This was the Essex Sykes Funeral Home. Oh. And at the bottom, he had the barber shop. Was on the bottom floor. Next to it was our little, we call our ice cream shop. Was next door to that. These are some of the homes that was in Old Town before they was all demolished. This is what Kings Memorial, the original Kings Memorial. It was absolutely gorgeous old church. And they tore it down bad.
Today, many of the homes and businesses that Miss Tate once loved in her neighborhood are gone.
But a few important buildings are left, including one of the most pivotal in Decatur's history.
Of course, you'll recognize that. Yes. First
Missionary Baptist Church.
Miss Tate had carefully drawn its architecture. A 2-story brick building, boxy bell tower, tall arched windows, a covered walkway.
Most of the historic Black buildings in Decatur are gone, but First Missionary Baptist, one of the most important, is left. In this episode, we'll tell its story. Welcome to Urban Roots, a podcast that preserves place through story. We're your hosts. I'm Daylan Wetzel, a historic preservationist focused on Black history.
And I'm Vanessa Quirk, a journalist who writes about cities and inclusive development. And this is the first of a 2-part series on Decatur, Alabama. In this episode, we're going to be telling you the story of First Missionary Baptist Church.
Like many Black churches, First Missionary Baptist was everything to African American folks in Decatur. A school, a home, an organizing center, a social hub where lifelong bonds were forged. Its walls, windows, and doors tell the story of this Black community, one that has overcome many challenges.
In this episode, we will explore its historic significance, introduce you to people who are cornerstones of the church, and share what its proud community is doing to ensure its preservation for the future. I see the rail lines. Whoop.
I feel the rail lines. Now we're in Old Town.
Oh, we're here already?
We arrived at First Missionary Baptist Church, a simple brick building on the corner of Vine Street and Grove Street Northwest on a cool January afternoon.
Let's head in.
Let's go. Let's try to go this way.
We walked through a side entrance into a newer annex and headed up some stairs toward what we assumed was the original nave.
We sat in some pews and quietly waited for the pastor. This place makes me want to take my shoes off.
It's, like you want to put your toes in the red lush carpet.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Before we get started
Yes.
too far, can we ask you to say your name for us
Yes.
and what you do?
Yes, my name is Daylan Woodall, and I'm the senior pastor here at First Missionary Baptist Decatur.
We asked Pastor Woodall to tell us the origin story of First Missionary Baptist.
In 1866, a year after the Civil War, 21 former slaves met in the home of Miss Jane Young, who herself had been a slave. Amazing that she had a home, as humble as it may have been, and they founded what was then called First Baptist Colored. Now, before the Civil War was over, many slaves were not permitted to gather and worship. Some slaves were only permitted to gather and worship in the presence of a white overseer. But many congregations surfaced immediately after the Civil War because they now were able to freely express themselves. And how fitting is it that the church started in a home? Because the church for generations was a communal, spiritual, intellectual, psychological, sociological home.
But over time, the congregation outgrew Miss Jane Young's humble dwelling.
They moved soon after to a storefront.
Then, in the late 1910s, the next generation of congregants decided they wanted to build a church of their own.
Pastor Woodall pointed to the stained glass windows.
We're standing bathed in the light of some of these beautiful stained glass windows. They're green, they're gold, they're red, they're yellow. It is an Italian stained glass manufactured a little over 100 years ago. These windows were appraised as being priceless. The glass is no longer being manufactured, so we're particular about protecting them. They represent in a very real way the historical heritage and legacy of our church. The windows bear the names of people and organizations and families who gave privately, who helped raise funds for the support of the church.
One of the windows bears the name Stirs.
Dr. Willis Stirs was the first African-American physician in Decatur.
In the early 1900s, he started Decatur's first hospital, the Cottage Home Infirmary, and a pharmacy, Magnolia Drugstore, with his wife, Eva.
She was also the owner and editor-in-chief of The Guardian, Decatur's first African-American newspaper.
Another window reads Sykes. In 1901, Solomon Sykes and his brother established the Magnolia Sykes Cemetery, the only cemetery in Decatur that was open to African Americans until 1965.
But it wasn't just wealthy Black members who contributed to the church's funds.
What the church did was have nickel and penny and dime drives. And in the early 1920s, because of the contributions of people who had very little but gave the precious little they had, the church contracted Wallace Rayfield to build this church. And the original part of Rayfield's design is where we're standing right now.
Wallace Rayfield, the second licensed African-American architect in American history.
He was born in Macon, Georgia in 1873, then trained at Howard University, the Pratt Institute, and Columbia University.
He taught at the Tuskegee Institute and then established an architecture firm called W.A. Rayfield & Company in Birmingham, Alabama.
In Decatur, Rayfield designed King's Memorial United Methodist's original 1908 church, which was replaced by a newer building in the 80s.
He was also the architect of Wayman Chapel AME Church, which was constructed in Decatur circa 1923.
And he designed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which tragically gained notoriety when the KKK bombed the building on a Sunday morning in 1963, killing 4 young girls.
That building shares many characteristics with First Missionary Baptist. Detailed brickwork, the covered walkway with arches, the boxy bell tower.
There are a couple of architectural features I want to point out. So as you walk down, you feel the floor slope. The sloping floor gives everyone the same line of sight. And so the person who you're sitting in front of, they're able to look over your head and kind of see everything. There's another functional reason. The building was built before amplification of sound. And so Rayfield, in his architectural genius, built a building that is a natural funnel. The pastor's voice is naturally being carried out from the pulpit to the congregation.
While Pastor Woodall was talking, I walked to the back of the pews to put Rayfield's design to the test. It was clear as day. Really? Right, you're right. You're just talking in like a normal voice.
Yeah, I haven't raised my voice
I could hear you so well from the back. Like, if this room was full of people, I would still be able to hear.
And that's, you're talking about, 50, 60 yards away. And you can stand in the back by that window, and it sounds like we're standing next to each other.
It was pretty incredible. Yeah. He was kind of before, I feel like, his time in certain...
He was a complete architectural innovator in all of his buildings, and they're not all the same. Now, this building in 16th Street are very similar architecturally, but they're all, I think, an individual expression of his genius and of his creativity.
Considering how many projects Rayfield designed that are still standing, including 16th Street in Birmingham, and the fact that Rayfield worked at a time when a Black architect was unheard of, it's kind of shocking to think that this figure was almost forgotten from the history books. But he nearly was.
He never put his face on anything. He navigated by not making his Blackness a very prominent part of his business and had a mixed clientele. But ultimately, because of the Depression, he fell into poverty and his business and his brand into obscurity.
But in the early 1990s, a white Baptist minister / retired insurance executive by the name of Alan Duro was cleaning out his barn in Alabama when he discovered a Rayfield treasure trove.
411 printing plates that contained several hundred drawings, floor plans, advertisements, even family portraits. That fortuitous find led to a book written by Duro and a documentary called Finding the Cornerstone by Dwight Cameron.
It's really interesting, the fact his name was all over the cornerstones. It's on the cornerstone of our church, but nobody knew who he was.
We asked Pastor Woodall if he could show us the cornerstone.
The cornerstone's out here. You want to see that?
Yes, please.
Yeah, we'll see the cornerstone.
Gosh.
Okay. Organized 1866, erected 1921, First Baptist Church of Decatur, Alabama. Pastors Reverend S.M. Robinson, 1919, and Reverend W.P. Garth. Thank you.
Yes.
Reverend, I should have had you read it.
As in the family from Garth's barbershop that you heard about earlier.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
And then below it says W.A. Rayfield and Company Architects.
And then below it,
yeah.
Norwood and Brandon Contractors. And what I want to show you about intricacy is you see that the way these bricks are set right here from the corner, it makes them look like they're tied together.
Yeah, that is a really nice detail.
like the bricks have been woven together.
As we were talking, drops of water started landing on our heads. We headed inside and asked Pastor Woodall about the contractors and laborers, the people who would have laid the brick in the intricate way we saw outside.
Pastor Woodall told us that Miss Donna Castellano, a researcher in Huntsville, Alabama, just a short drive from Decatur, had gone through her town's Black newspapers to find out more about the contractor, Mr. Daniel Brandon, who built at least 15 structures in the area over his lifetime.
Daniel was born in 1866, and unlike his father, who was born enslaved, Daniel went to public school, where he learned to read and write. In 1886, at 20 years old, he married Ellen, an educated teacher, and then joined his father's construction company.
Henderson, Brandon, and Sons built multiple stores in Huntsville and eventually the federal courthouse there. When Henderson died, Daniel took over the business. The more they built, the more affluent, influential, and politically active the family became.
In 1901, the state of Alabama passed a state constitution that placed new restrictions on voting, like requiring you to know how to read and write, which prevented many African Americans from casting ballots. Voting rights for Blacks would continue to be stymied in Alabama for decades.
In 1920, after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women were finally allowed to vote. Even though many Black women in Madison County met the requirements outlined in the 1901 Constitution, only 6 were allowed to register to vote. Daniel's wife, Ellen, was among them.
The same year that Ellen cast her ballot, Daniel was laying the bricks for First Missionary Baptist. It was likely the only structure that he built that was designed by a Black architect. And its history would have been deeply tied with the fight for civil rights. Here's Pastor Woodall again.
And I want to say a word about the design of African American churches of this scope and style, is that they're designed as fortresses. They look very much like castles. You see the spires, you see the arches. If the civil rights movement was a battle, you needed a fortress where a community could meet and be safe. You needed a fortress where a community could meet and fortify themselves for the struggle and for the battle that they would be engaged in for their own personhood.
In the 30s, First Missionary, like other Black churches in Decatur, would become a fortress when the community needed it most.
In 1931, 2 white women in northern Alabama accused 9 Black youth, whose ages ranged from 12 to 19, of rape. There was little evidence to support their claim. Nevertheless, at the first trial in Scottsboro, Alabama, the all-white jury sentenced everyone but the youngest to death.
Fortunately, some of the boys were granted retrials in Decatur. Their lawyer's first order of business in town was to try and subvert Alabama's racist jury system, which asserted that Black people were incapable of standing as jury members.
The lawyers met with Old Town community leaders in First Missionary Baptist, who helped them put together a list of Black residents qualified to serve as jurors, including business owners, doctors, and teachers. But none were selected to serve on the jury.
The media followed the trials closely. The KKK did too. Anyone who testified in favor of the boys was in danger of being harassed or killed.
In 1937, after several retrials and appeals, 4 of the boys were released.
Although the verdicts were not favorable for all the boys, these trials in Decatur had a big impact on American history. Because of them, the Supreme Court found that it was unlawful for Black people to be excluded from juries.
Throughout it all, Decatur's Black community rallied and supported each other. They would do so again and again in the coming decades.
We wanted to know more about what it was like to attend First Missionary Baptist in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, what those battles of civil rights would have felt like from inside of these walls.
So Pastor Woodall invited us to come back on a Bible study day to hear from his parishioners, folks who had long histories of attending the church firsthand.
Job starts that book with millions of dollars, and then in a day he loses everything. Mm-hmm. But Job cannot afford to believe that his resources are what determines the worth of his life.
After Bible study wrapped, Pastor Woodall invited us to meet the crew.
My name is Stephanie Anita Gray. I was born in 1960.
My name is Brenda Smith, and I've been here a long time. This is Mary Kelly. I'm 73 almost. She is too.
I'm Mary Lou Kelly, and I've been here all my life.
Deacon Lester Fletcher.
Nella Fletcher.
And who's this person on your lap?
My grandbaby, and she's Aubrey, and she loves to come to church and see Powwow. Can you tell her your name?
Aubrey.
Aubrey.
Well done.
She's really not that quiet.
We gave Aubrey some candy and an iPad to bribe her into quiet and started asking questions about the cornerstones of their church and community. Are there people that are important that we should be looking more into that you know of?
Miss Ella Freeman.
Miss Etta Freeman, currently 106 years old, who taught almost everybody in the community.
A beautiful lady. Mrs. Emma Warren, she was one of our organists.
They were teachers. Clara Jean.
Clara Jean Johnson, who not only taught, but sewed everybody's Christmas dresses.
And a lot of the deacons here, Mr. Rogers, he was one of the teachers at Lakeside.
Lakeside High, which was an all-black high school until it was forced to close in 1969 due to integration orders. Deacon Rogers was a history teacher there. He was also the one responsible for getting First Missionary Baptist listed on the State Register of Historic Places.
I truly hate that Deacon Rogers is not here. He was our historian. Deacon Charles Rogers and my Aunt Katie were very tight. The church didn't really run unless they ran it.
Ms. Emma Kate Gray, born 1915.
You did not mess with Miss Gray.
When students would turn 18, she would make sure they were registered to vote. And because of that, she knew everybody's birthday. And she would come around and tell the kids in the church, your birthday's coming up. You need to get registered to vote, right?
Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, First Missionary Baptist was full to the brim of people, mostly teachers, but also doctors and nurses.
One of the biggest programs they hosted for the entire community was Vacation Bible School. It was kind of like summer camp, but with more religious education. Here's Nella Fletcher again.
The reason we were the first church to have Vacation Bible School was because so many of our members were teachers, and they were off in the summer. Those of us that lived on this side of town and the ones in the housing projects. We would have 200 people here for Vacation Bible School.
Vacation Bible School, you would have a lot of fun, would all look forward to at the end, having the cookies and orange juice and, just playing.
You could see kids just racing back. There's a little building out there, racing back there to get to those 2 cookies, 2 vanilla wafers, and that little cup of Kool-Aid.
Vacation Bible School wasn't the only thing going on in those days. Every child at First Missionary Baptist was involved in something.
I had to come to choir practice. I had to go to Sunday school. I had to be a delegate for Sunbeam Band and BT, all of those wonderful things.
How did you choose which group to be a part of?
You didn't.
You didn't choose.
You didn't do.
It was
You
by your
didn't.
age.
It was by your
Somebody
age.
chose for you. You didn't
And
choose.
your mama said you're gonna be
Yeah,
in the
that's right.
Sunbeam Band.
That's
You're gonna wear a
right.
yellow skirt and a white blouse.
Yeah, and you
Then
don't-
when you get old enough, you get to be in the
Red circle.
red circles. You get to wear a white dress and a red corsage. And it was so much fun.
It was. We had the biggest choir ever was. When Reverend Gabriel was here,
Mary Lou Kelly.
you couldn't hardly get in that choir stand up. We had so many people. We had about 40-something people, young people. Everybody was coming here to be in our choir. And we used to be on the radio every Sunday night.
This wasn't an official activity, but everyone had a fond memory of going to Miss Susie Wright's cafe, the Green Frog Front, which was right across the street from the church.
That I loved that little cafe because when I was a little girl, they had ice cream.
And Sundays, when we gave our offering in Sunday school, I would tell my sister, just put a quarter in, because we're going to go to Miss Susie's when we leave Sunday school. So we would go across the street real quick and get us some candy or whatever and come back before the choir members marched in. Because my mama was in the choir and I had better be on that back row so she could see my face.
Miss Susie didn't only cater to the kids, though.
A lot of the men that worked on the L&N Railroad, that was their first stop because I don't know how Miss Susie did it, but you could get some alcohol in Miss Susie's cafe. She had a bar and those little round stools that you see. I remember that as a kid, and they were red base. And then she had those booths, and there was always people in there, always. It didn't matter if it was Sunday morning. And if Miss Susie still had things going on at 11 o'clock service, things were still going on. The jukebox was still going. Well, Mr. Deacon Bryant would go over, have his few words with her. By the time Deacon Bryant would come back in and walk back to his seat over there, you didn't hear all of that. She had enough respect that she would turn it down. But it would get loud.
First Missionary Baptist and Miss Susie's weren't the only spots on Vine Street that drew crowds.
Vine Street was hopping at one point in time. It was just the church here. The church was here. But you had clubs, you had restaurants, you had a whole bunch of stuff.
There were stores all around. Across the street was a cafe, a barbershop, and the funeral home was on the corner.
All of them are torn down now.
All of this was back when Decatur was segregated. If you were Black and in Old Town, you knew where you could walk and be safe. If you had to leave Old Town, that was a different story. Here's Brenda Smith again.
At that one point in time, not everybody had a car. See, and a lot of places you had to walk to get to. Some places we had to pass were not safe.
There was a Black cab driver that folks in Old Town could call to get a ride. But back then, most people would take the bus to get around. And of course, the bus was segregated.
My mother would tell me where I was supposed to sit on the bus.
Right.
Baby, don't sit up front when you get on the bus. Make sure you sit back, past the middle.
Oh, I know why
I decided that day I'm not sitting in the back at all, so you forget that. And the bus driver, he looked through the mirror and he saw me. He didn't say a word.
There are a bunch of people in our community who will attest that Miss Mother Freeman, who's a member of our church, was pregnant with her son and was asked to get up and move. And this was, I think, maybe 5 years before what happened with Rosa Parks happened. And she refused to do it. And it didn't make the news.
Right.
And it didn't go in the history book. But the same thing that touched off the Montgomery bus boycott happened to a lot of people.
And some of that, my parents kind of sheltered us from. And we didn't know, like the Dairy Queen, we didn't know that you had to go to that window to order. You couldn't go inside.
Oh, down at Bob Gibson, you had to go in the back door.
You had to go in the back door at Bob Gibson's.
Mary Lou Kelly had a vivid memory of going to Bob Gibson's as a child with her family. This would have been the early 60s.
My cousins, they get out before me. I was the last one to get out because I was the youngest. I jumped out the car. I wanted to go with the rest of them. My aunt turned around and she yelled at me so loud. I hadn't done anything. All I did was got out the car like everybody else. She said, "You get back in that car. You are not going in here. You don't walk through nobody's back door. You will be the one. You will not go through nobody's back door." And it hurt my feelings so bad because I didn't understand. I hadn't done anything wrong. But I understood after I got older. She didn't want me to have that type of an experience.
Decatur slowly integrated throughout the 60s and 70s, but integration came with a new set of challenges.
Mary Lou Kelly was in Lakeside High's graduating class of 1969. That year, the state of Alabama was still resisting desegregation mandates. So rather than integrate the school's children, instead they moved teachers around.
So in her senior year, a few white teachers came to Lakeside, and some of her favorite Black teachers, like Mr. Rogers, were moved to white schools.
Then developers started building newer homes in other parts of the city, and people started leaving Old Town so they could own their own homes.
At the same time, now that Black people were allowed to purchase goods in white stores, Black stores started to lose business, and the majority of stores in Old Town were Black-owned.
Exactly what happened next is kind of unclear. Unfortunately, a lot of the planning documents of these decades have been lost or destroyed. But here's what we've pieced together from our research and interviews.
In 1975, the city of Decatur approved the Vine Street Modernization Plan, which categorized 93% of Old Town's residential buildings and 90% of its commercial buildings as either deteriorated or dilapidated.
According to long-term residents, while some buildings were in bad shape, most weren't. Even so, they started to disappear.
By the 90s, substantial portions of the neighborhood were gone.
As Old Town diminished, so too did the congregation of First Missionary Baptist.
Even though the congregation is far fewer in numbers today, everyone we spoke to was still so proud of their church.
So I love First Baptist Church. I'm not going to lie to you.
I love this place. I have no intentions of leaving.
I love my church. I never have even considered leaving. And I'm quite proud of our history. To know that God has kept us 157 years, that's a long time.
We thanked everyone for their time and their stories. And as we were leaving, they asked us one question.
So y'all be back Sunday?
Good, how are you? Thank you. The second we walked back into First Missionary Baptist on Sunday morning, everyone greeted us with big smiles and good mornings, and we felt welcome instantly. Good morning. How are you? Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
As the organ played, we settled into the pews.
Like the middle row here?
Sure. Good morning.
Good morning.
As we prepare for worship, our call to worship is found in Psalms 138.
After a short reading, Pastor Woodall got up to speak.
Good morning, First Baptist. Good morning, First Baptist. It's another day's journey.
Then he gave his pastoral remarks.
We are on the precipice of another King holiday, another opportunity to remember the life and legacy of a man who gave his life in service to his people. It's true that he never gave up, but it's also true that he wanted to give up. So many times the load got heavy, hard for him to bear, but he kept on keeping on. And in so doing, he inspired us to keep on keeping on. So as we stand on the precipice of another King Day, that's what I want to say to you. Keep on keeping on. Sometimes the load gets heavy. Sometimes the circumstances of our life are difficult. Sometimes the report from the doctor is bad, but keep on keeping on. Give God a hand clap of praise. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Oh, turn me around. Oh, turn me around. I ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on. Oh, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Oh, turn me around.
When we left Decatur in January, I thought we gotten more information than we could ever need to make this episode. But in early April, I got an email from Pastor Woodall. He had some exciting news to share. News that he said could change the future of the church. Okay, so I've got Pastor Woodall with me here. Pastor Woodall, tell me what you found here.
We have a collection of documents here recently gifted to the church.
One of the parishioners, Miss Gladys Smith, had recently passed. When her son was going through her things, he came across a cache of church documents.
It has the names of the people in the church who acted as guarantors for the funds. There's basically a paragraph or a few paragraphs on the life story and on the personalities whose names are in our windows. This fills in a big historical gap for us.
The documents also included a historical survey of the church, written in 1989 by the late Deacon Rogers, the history teacher who helped the church get on the state register in the first place.
Here he writes, the mortgage language was very stringent. It stated that full payment would be required 5 days after any late payment. They have been financed under these almost predatory terms, right? So the margin is so thin. This is 1920. We're on the outskirts of the Depression, right? And so at any given time, we could have lost everything. It's a chronicle of the sacrifice of people.
It's the kind of sacrifice that has happened throughout First Missionary Baptist's history. In the 80s, when the church was in desperate need of funds for renovations, church members like Miss Gladys Smith and her husband Curtis Smith put up their own home as collateral.
Deacon Curtis Smith and Sister Gladys Smith, who were mocked by people in their community because churches folded and failed all the time, were derided by people who knew them as making an unwise decision, gambling with their financial security and stability. For what? The church. And to ultimately have those sacrifices pay off in such a way that the church still lives on even after they're gone.
Pastor Woodall is keenly aware of the importance of these documents for their church's history, and he and his members are thinking deeply about how to preserve them for posterity.
These will be the Deacon Curtis Smith and Sister Gladys Smith papers that will go into a historical archive that we'll make available to our members and people in the community. We're going to digitize them and they will go into a physical archive. We're going to do a call for papers and documents from our members, and we will build out the archive that way. There's that image in West African culture of the griot who keeps the community's stories, who is like a library, who is like an encyclopedia, who is the source and the fount of wisdom for the community. And the church has that cultural responsibility to keep the community's stories.
Pastor Woodall is not alone. First Missionary Baptist will not be a lone fortress holding and protecting Decatur's Black history. A few blocks away, Miss Frances Tate, who you met at the beginning of this episode, is, as we speak, working with town historians Peggy Towns and Reverend Ragland and others in the community to create a museum. It will commemorate not only the Scottsboro Boys, but also Old Town itself. Frances's many paintings will hang on its walls. It hasn't been easy, but they are showing that preserving Black history in Decatur is possible. People do care. They're not content to sit around and watch Old Town be erased any longer.
The future of First Missionary Baptist is uncertain. They have many hurdles ahead. But if history could tell us anything, that's never stopped this congregation before.
I'm gonna keep on.
Thank you for listening to Urban Roots, a podcast from Urbanist Media. Your hosts are me, Vanessa Quirk, and Decca Hussein-Wetzel.
This episode was written and executive produced by Vanessa Quirk, with support from me, Decca Hussein-Wetzel. It was edited and mixed by Andrew Calloway. Music by Dom James Levin-Arity. Editorial support from Francis Ramirez O'Shea, and recording help from Alexander Ritchie. Huge thanks to everyone who spoke with us for this episode, including Frances Tate, Pastor Woodall, Donna Castellano, Georgia Rogers, Etta Freeman, Stephanie Gray, Mary Lou Kelly, Brenda Smith, Lester Fletcher, Nella Fletcher, Leslie Fletcher, and Annette Davis. And also many thanks to Peggy Towns, whose tour around Old Town and book, Scottsboro Unmasked, gave us crucial context for this episode. The nonprofit that Ms. Frances Tate is a part of is called Celebrating Early Old Town with Art, or CEOTA for short. Its mission is to preserve, promote, educate, and share the rich history of the Old Town community. The CEOTA board is currently developing the Decatur Scottsboro Boys Civil Rights Museum. If you'd like to learn more or get involved, visit www.sbcmuseum.org.
And many thanks to Caroline Swope and the City of Decatur, who made this episode possible. This material was produced with assistance from the Historic Preservation Fund, administered by the National Park Service Department of the Interior.
Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of the Interior.
This episode was part 1 of our Decatur series. Make sure you're subscribed to Urban Roots to get updated when part 2 drops. You can also follow us on Instagram at Urban Roots Culture or subscribe to our newsletter at urbanistmedia.org.
Urbanist Media is a 501c3. If you believe in the work we do in preserving underrepresented places through story and would like to help us make more episodes possible in the future, then please consider making a tax-deductible donation via Venmo or PayPal at Urbanist Media.
Okay, I think that's it, Decca. Want to hit the good people with our new tagline?
Urban Roots, preserving place through story.